Real Conversations in the QC is sponsored by Accentra Credit Union. This is Real Conversations in the QC,
where Black experiences matter.
Black stories are heard.
And real conversations happen. So, let's get started.
Good morning and welcome to Real Conversations in the QC. America just celebrated 250 years of history, a story that can't be told without the story of Black America. This week, we revisit a conversation I had with Marion Meginnis about redlining in Davenport. We previously only aired a small portion of that discussion and are now bringing you our entire conversation. Marion, welcome to Real Conversations in the Quad Cities.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me today.
Yes, it's good having you here and things. And I know we had some conversation beforehand, and there's one of the information, a little bit of the information we talked about. I want to get to that. But first, I would like for you to, for those who don't know exactly what redlining is, can you explain that and then also talk about when did redlining show up here in the Quad Cities, specifically in Davenport?
Absolutely. So redlining is a term used to defining different parts of cities and breaking them out into areas that were considered desirable or undesirable for doing loans, for mortgage loans.
Okay.
And so it came about in the 1930s. It was tied to the Great Depression. Things were starting to go south with home mortgages long before the actual crash in 29, but when the stock market crashed, by 1933 there were a tremendous number of people whose home mortgages were underwater. Their houses, the value of houses dropped by like 35% across the country. And so people were struggling to stay in their homes. They couldn't pay their mortgages. And it was such a tremendous number. It was 40 to 50% of people were underwater with their mortgages. So not a few, many people, almost half the people in America who own homes. And so this was starting to impact banks. And it had a very, very deleterious effect on what was happening with banks. And of course, there were bank failures that happened during that time as well. So the federal government, in trying to do something about this, set up something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the Federal Housing Administration was set up the next year. HOLC was set up in 1933, and FHA, which we still have today, was set up in 1934.
Okay.
And what they had to figure out was what they wanted to do was they wanted to sort of take over the mortgages and to take them to stabilize banking. And so what they did is they offered loans to banks, and then they would take over the mortgages, but then they had to decide what kind of money they would loan people. And so they went into, there were 239 American cities where the HOLC, working with local bankers, real estate people, insurance, home insurance people, and their own crews in D.C., this all came out of D.C., looked at American cities, looked at the people who lived in them, what they made, what their income was, and based on that, the risk that was present in each neighborhood or each area of a city, and determined how much would they loan in terms of mortgage to offset the cost. And so it was redlining was the worst color, and so the cities, all of these cities, including Davenport, were color coded. Once they had done all this research, they were color coded, and green meant this is a good positive area. Blue was a stable area. Yellow was considered hazardous or potentially declining, and then red was, it was the worst. So these were places, and so they would then, in the green areas, they would loan, they could loan 70%, they might loan 70% of the value of the mortgage to the banks. In the blue, that was still pretty good. But as you started getting into yellow and you started getting into the red, in some cases, no loans at all. Okay. And one of the things they did when they did this, and these maps were done about 1934, and they were done across the country. After, they stayed in D.C., they were in storage somewhere. They weren't really available, and then they became available only a few years ago. They became digitized. And so people can now look back, and what you can see in these maps is kind of what happened to inner cities. I mean, the impact they had on inner cities in terms of how money was loaned to people to buy houses, and it's very, very telling with impacts today.
So the mapping, because that's comes up with a second question of mine. That's a conversation we had earlier. But before I get to that, you mentioned this wasn't in every city in the country, but
right.
Okay.
It was about, well, so it was cities 40,000 or more.
Okay.
So, Rock Island, Moline, this hasn't happened there. Dubuque, I think, is one. In Iowa, Des Moines was one.
Mm-hmm.
So there were not a lot of cities in Iowa, but all of these maps were done. And then there was something called city maps, which it's somewhat related, but the HOLC maps are the one that people look at now and you can really see the impact because they were very detailed. After they sort of stopped using the HOLC maps, then the FHA continued doing city maps, and they were a smaller number, and that continued sort of the bias toward it. It was biased toward certain neighborhoods, and it continued and that way of looking and assessing risk in a city and in terms of a loan, became almost part of the tradition of home mortgages.
Right.
That came into the present day.
Okay. So like these maps, and when we had the conversation, we had a chance to sit down before and talk about this, and you really opened my eyes to be able to see some things. But
right.
With, we talked about University of Richmond's mapping inequality, redlining. It's called Redlining and New Deal America Project. Walk us through going to that website.
Right.
I was able to see that, but explain to everybody what's all in there.
Yes, this is available to everybody, and it is really incredible. And I watched I said to you, Tim, let's look at your hometown in 1936, and we went to your hometown, and I saw your eyes because you could go to where you grew up and see what was happening there and look around your city. And so it is called Mapping Inequality. It was the University of Richmond, and there were some other, Virginia Tech, there were a few other schools that assisted, University of Maryland, but it is the University of Richmond that has all of these maps available. And when you open this website, and if you just Google, if anybody's interested, and if any city that you're from, go on this, just Google Mapping Inequality. They can find the website. It'll pop up. It says go to the map, and when you click on it, it's a map of the entire United States with lots of little circles. And then as you zoom in toward the city, then it will bring the map up for that city, and you can go down to detail. But it isn't just the map that's there.
Right.
What's also there is all of the notes that were attached to that map when they did these maps, talking about the different neighborhoods and how much risk they would take and how much they would loan in a neighborhood. And that's where you really see some very disturbing details at times, because they were in the way they talked about different populations, whether it was African American, whether it was Asian, whether it was immigrant populations, and how well, and they characterized neighborhoods by the people who lived in them. And it wasn't just about their income. It wasn't just about income. It was cultural characteristics as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is the really eye-opening part. And what you begin to see there is, you see what happened to those parts. We talk about the inner cities of our country, our urban core neighborhoods in a lot of cities and how they declined, and how it's been difficult. And we have had that challenge here in Davenport, something that I'm very passionate about. Mm-hmm. And you see it right there. That's part of where that began for sure, because it institutionalized mortgage lending. Now that we have laws now that prevent that, the federal government has stepped in many decades ago and said you can't discriminate in terms of mortgage, and there are laws that protect that. But there was nothing then, and so they were trying to pull the homeowners out of a crisis, but it's very disturbing, the long-term results.
It is.
Sure.
It is. So a lot of good information,
Yeah.
like you said, and the detail. I mean, it's just you can spend a lot of time looking at
Right.
looking at that site.
Exactly, you can, and there are other things. So what the University of Richmond has done is they've so you have the maps, you have all the descriptions digitized, of all the original comments for each section of each city, but then they look at health, their correlations between the health score of a neighborhood that was maybe outlined in red in 1934 and today. You see that there are some of the same issues, disparate, and you look at another, you compare within a neighborhood, and they do this on that website for you. Not every map does this, but they looked at one city with one neighborhood that was red and a green neighborhood, and how different, and what those same health scores, poverty, everything, it's parallels today. And so these are really important and significant things to in terms of understanding what happened here.
Okay. So looking, like I said, I was able to go back and look at my hometown, but we're here in Davenport, talking about Davenport. Which neighborhoods in Davenport were most affected with redlining? If someone was to go in there now and look at that.
So what you're going to see is most of the area south of Locust, which was a great deal of the city. McClellan Heights would not be there. Certain areas close to Locust, the Washington Street corridor wouldn't be. It was blue, I think. Some areas around, then as you get just north of Locust, around what is now Vanderveer Park, those areas. But what you see is a lot of red and a lot of yellow, and a lot of red in the around, the whole downtown area. I am in the neighborhoods that we still think of today as our south of Locust neighborhoods that, often investment is more difficult. Davenport, in terms of, they did not have a large population of new European immigrants or Asian immigrants. But when you look at cities that have, you see things like, well, there's a big Asian immigrant, and the houses look good, but because of this immigration, the number of immigrants living here, we're going to rate it lower. And you do see some of that in Davenport in terms of African American population. Davenport did not have in the 1900 a very large African American population, and it established itself. Of course, the city was, most of the city in 1900 would have been south of Locust anyway. Okay. But you see that language in the Davenport. Maps as well. I have a neighbor, my good friend Mary Houston, who is 87 now. She'll be 88 next year, and she grew up in Goose Hollow, which is a neighborhood, and it is called out in this map. It's between. Very close to the station here, but it is between Harrison and Ripley, north of 9th Street. So Goose Hollow there's a park called Goose Hollow, and it is the neighborhood above that. At that time, there were houses above on the north side of 9th Street as well. But and you see there they talk about that particular area. The whole area around it is yellow. But they call out in the description, particularly this area, and talk about, and the language they use is not language you would use today. They use the C word, and they talk about this population and how it's not it's terms of, it's not a bad population, but because this population is here, no loans will be given in this area, and they call that area out. The whole area is yellow around it, but they call that out and say no loans here.
No loans there. Thanks.
No loans here, and they speak specifically, and they talk about the diverse population.
So, in the redlining areas and even possibly the yellow areas, day-to-day impacts on families living in those areas. What do you...
Well, back in that time, what you would have is you would not be able to get a mortgage for your house, or you would get a smaller mortgage or maybe no mortgage. And so it becomes very difficult if you're trying to buy into an area and you need a mortgage to buy a house. If an area has been redlined And those back in that, and if the redlined areas, there were no, we're not doing mortgages here. This is not going to happen here. And so you would not be able to buy a house. So what's that? That's going to push you out somewhere else. It's going to push you into another part of the city. And so that area is going to deteriorate. You're not going to be able to get a mortgage to fix things or, to do repairs. And so you have a situation where houses sit empty and they become more deteriorated and there is an investment to fix them up. But if that's all that's available to you, then that may be where you need to be, that may be where you end up having to live.
Exactly.
In a house that you can't even get the money to fix up.